The night settled in like a quilt someone forgot to warm. I stood by the fireplace watching the thin tongue of flame bend and straighten inside the glass. Jason sat rigid on the sofa, his shoulders lifted toward his ears as if he expected a blow. Victoria crossed one leg over the other and studied her manicure. My father paced, then stopped at the edge of the rug as if a line had been drawn there years ago that he would never dare cross. He cleared his throat and smoothed his tie. "Your grandfather will not be attending the wedding." His voice carried that clipped finality I remembered from sick days and report cards, the tone that turned a conversation into a verdict. Jason blinked cheap bravery, trying to fill his eyes. Victoria didn't look at anyone, just tightened her grip on his arm. I felt heat move up my neck. "Dad, this is Jason's wedding. Grandpa belongs there." The words sounded small in the big room, swallowed by books and framed photographs that looked back at us like jurors. "He belongs where I decide," my father said, never raising his voice. "This marriage sets a standard. I won't have Henry's old-fashioned habits embarrassing Victoria's family." He looked at her, then nodded his son, and she gave him a polite smile that never reached her cheeks. Jason chewed the inside of his lip. "Maybe we should?" He stopped and glanced at Victoria. She touched his sleeve and shook her head the tiniest bit, like a whisper no one else could hear. I stepped closer to the hearth. "He raised us when Mom got sick. He kept this house from falling apart. He's not an ornament you move out of sight." My father's eyes slid my way, cool as a winter pane. "Stella, you still think life is about gratitude." He turned back to Jason. "It's about presentation. This is an alliance with people who know what they're doing. They expect a certain kind of guest list." Jason's hands knotted on his knees. "I don't know, Dad." The words were barely there. Victoria lifted her chin and finally spoke. "It might be better to avoid confusion. My parents would prefer consistency." She kept her tone light as if she were reciting from a menu, but the message was hard as cut glass. Jason swallowed and stared at the floor. I felt that old ache under my ribs, the one that shows up when someone you love hands over their voice. "It isn't right," I said quietly. "You know it isn't." My father exhaled through his nose as if I'd missed the point of a lecture. "We're done." He turned and left the room. The mantel clock ticked in the space he left behind, each click loud enough to count the distance between us. Jason didn't look at me. Victoria stood, smoothed her skirt, and brushed an invisible bit of lint from his shoulder. "We should confirm the tasting," she murmured, and they moved out together. Two shadows crossed over one decision that didn't belong to them. I didn't sleep much that week. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa at the kitchen table spreading jam with the same care he used for signatures, always asking if we wanted a second cup of coffee. I tried to imagine his face when he heard he was unwelcome. I couldn't. He had a way of folding his feelings into stillness, and stillness doesn't show its edges. 3 days later, a heavy envelope arrived, thick ivory paper, my father's handwriting across the front, precise, controlled, as if the ink itself were under contract. I carried it to the counter, aware of how quiet the house had become. No music from Jason's room, no footsteps above mine. The furnace hummed like a distant plane. For a second I told myself it was a late invitation, a peace offering with neat corners and time-stamped grace. I slipped a finger under the seal and opened it. The first page took a breath from me. It wasn't an invitation. It was a ledger dressed up for company. Venue and decor for a rented estate. A staggering line for catering and imported wines. A globe-spanning honeymoon with a price tag that looked like a misprint until I realized the zeros were meant to be there. $4 billion stacked into polite columns. At the bottom, beneath 2 looping signatures, Jason's, hesitant Victoria's, practiced, my father had added a note. A single sentence, narrow and sharp as a knife, tucked into a napkin. "Be grateful I've given you a chance to contribute." Not the exact words, but the sting was exact enough. I set the paper down and steadied myself on the counter. For a moment I watched the light scratch across the marble and thought about what it cost to be heartless in such a pretty font. Then a scrape of a cane sounded from the hall. Grandpa stepped in this afternoon, making a silver border around his shoulders. "What did we get?" he asked, as if this were a catalog order or a school fundraiser I'd forgotten to deliver. I handed him the pages. He adjusted his glasses and read. The lines around his eyes didn't move. When he finished, he rested the packet on the counter and tapped it once with his fingertip. I waited for the crack of anger, the kind that lets you know you aren't crazy for feeling what you feel. It didn't come. Instead, he gave a small nod, like a craftsman checking the back of a drawer. Pride, he said almost to himself, doesn't ask. It invoices. He looked up then, and there was a clarity in his gaze that reminded me of sunny winter days when the air holds still and sound travels for miles. "They banned you," I said, "and they expect you to pay for the privilege." My throat tightened. "How can you be calm?" He lifted the packet and slid it back into the envelope as neatly as it had come. "A thing can be both insulting and useful," he said. "This tells me what your father believes about power." He rested the envelope on the counter square and centered. "He thinks it moves only in one direction. He thinks it sits in chairs with good views." I wanted to tell him I would handle it, that I would drive to my father's office and lay the paper on his desk and make him look at the damage he'd done to simple decency. But something in Grandpa's posture relaxed, but rooted stopped me. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man letting a story show him its shape before he turned the page. "You're not going to call him," I said. "No." He straightened his glasses and glanced toward the window. The late sun singled out dust motes in a bright column, and they drifted up and down like ash over an old campfire. If a tree wants to prove it's taller than the house, you don't argue. You step back and give it room to fall. I leaned against the sink. Jason signed it. "He's a good boy who forgot how to stand up," Grandpa said, and the sadness in his voice landed gently, as if he were remembering a time when he'd done the same. I folded my arms across my chest. "What do you want me to do? For now?" He looked at me again, the corners of his mouth lifting a fraction. "Tell me what you see. Not what you fear, not what you hope, just what you see." That evening, the house filled with movement, but no conversation. My father's phone lit the hallway as he strode past, barking short orders that sounded like threats. Jason stood by the front window checking his watch and then checking nothing at all. Victoria sent a picture of a dress to someone whose approval mattered to her more than mine. I made tea and pretended it was for the comfort of it, not the habit of having something warm to hold when I felt cold in places that didn't show. I told Grandpa what the planner's emails looked like on my father's screen when he left the office door cracked. I told him I heard the word deposit 3 times in one call, like a drum someone was tired of beating. I told him 2 neighbors stopped talking when I turned into the cereal aisle, and one of them said, "It's a shame, really," as if she were commenting on weather. He listened and didn't interrupt. When I ran out of details, he stood and touched the back of the chair where he'd been sitting the way you tap a nail to check if the wood holds. "Thank you," he said. "We don't need to push anything. Pride does the pushing." Later, I walked down the hall and paused outside my father's study. His voice was lower now, frayed around the edges. "Do you know who I am?" he said to someone who apparently did. "My father will make this right." He paused, then repeated it with more force. "He will make this right." The second time sounded less like a promise and more like a spell whose power he didn't fully trust. I found Jason in the kitchen turning a glass in his hands. He looked at me, then looked away. "Vic's parents want an update," he said. "They're asking about a tasting we haven't scheduled." His mouth twitched and tried to become a smile. "I don't even know what a tasting is." "You can tell them we'll have a wedding when we can afford one," I said, keeping my voice easy, as if we were talking about paint colors. He swallowed and set the glass down carefully, as if it might break from the weight of his fingers. "Dad says Grandpa's paying. He always has. It's part of the plan." "Plans change," I said, "especially when they're written on someone else's checkbook." He scrubbed a hand over his jaw. "He's just trying to make it perfect." He grimaced. "For them." He didn't have to specify who them were. They had perfectly ironed handkerchiefs and a talent for finding the center of a room without moving their feet. "You can make a promise to more than one person," I said, "but you can't keep them all if you never speak up." Jason's eyes drifted toward the front of the house where Victoria's laughter floated in from the foyer, like perfume that lingered past its welcome. He nodded once, then shook his head anyway. "I'll talk to him." It sounded like a line rehearsed for a play he didn't want to be in. When he left, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, the cream envelope still on the counter square and steady as a challenge. I picked it up and slid it into a drawer. It felt wrong to leave it out where sunlight could treat it kindly. The next morning, my father's voice thundered through the thin walls again. He was back to the tone that didn't allow response. "There will be no cancellations," he said, and something rattled against wood. "We are not common." I heard the soft tap of Grandpa's cane in the hallway behind me. He didn't go in. He didn't make speeches. He stood beside me, patient like water deciding where to flow. "What happens if they walk away?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Then we learn what's left when the show goes dark," he said. He eased himself into a chair and looked out through the screen door at the yard. A squirrel raced along the fence rail, paused and dashed on. It's good to learn that before the vows. I thought of Jason's hands tightening on his knees. I thought of Victoria arranging the air around her until it behaved. I thought of my father telling a florist that contracts were suggestions when they didn't serve him. "Do you want me to call anyone?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just keep watching. Bring me what you notice." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. There's more strength in steady attention than in shouting. By afternoon, the calls had a new tone. Less command, more negotiation. My father offered favors that sounded expensive. He named friends who might make problems vanish. I recognized the cadence of a man trying to stitch a rip without turning the garment inside out. I took a short walk around the block to clear my head. At the corner, Mrs. Duffy from 3 doors down paused with her dog and asked if we were excited for the big day, the way people try to be kind while their curiosity leans forward. I told her the date was still the date. She nodded and tugged the leash. The dog stared at me as if I had pocketed a treat I wouldn't admit to. When I returned, Grandpa was in his study, not reading but listening to the house. The old clock on his wall ticked steady as if it had never done anything else. I told him about the walk, the calls, the way Jason looked older when he thought no one watched. "Good," he said. He ran a soft cloth over the silver on his cane, then folded the cloth and set it aside. "We have what we need." I sat across from him and let the cushion shape itself around my weight. "What do we have?" "A clear picture," he said. "Pictures tell the truth when words are busy." We didn't discuss tactics. We didn't list vendors or tally favors owed. He didn't ask me to carry messages, and I didn't ask him to bless a plan. We sat together and let the quiet do work that noise can't. That evening, after the phones finally went still, I found Jason out on the back steps. The sky had gone the soft gray that holds off darkness for a few extra minutes. He rubbed his hands together and blew into them, though the air was warm enough. "Do you ever feel like you're watching yourself from across the room?" he asked without looking at me. "Sometimes," I said. "That's usually when I'm not speaking up." He nodded and stared at the lawn. "I keep thinking I'll fix it tomorrow." "Tomorrow's proud," I said. "Today's honest." He let out a humorless breath. "Vic wants me to call her father tonight and reassure him." He fiddled with his cuff as if the button were the problem. "What do I say?" "Say whatever's true," I said. "Then decide if you can live with it." He didn't answer. After a minute, he stood and went inside, leaving the door open so the kitchen light spilled onto the steps like a small square of day that forgot how to fade. I stayed outside a little longer, listening to the crickets tune themselves. When I finally rose, I knew 2 things with a certainty that didn't make noise. My father would push until there was nothing left to push against, and Grandpa would not meet him halfway just to keep peace. That wasn't peace at all. I closed the door, set the deadbolt, and turned off the kitchen light. In the dim, the drawer with the envelope looked like a shadow that knew my name. I touched the cool metal handle and let it go. Upstairs, the floor creaked under Grandpa's careful steps, and the steady knock of his cane matched the heartbeat I felt in my hands. Morning would bring more calls, more smiling demands, more polite threats wrapped in ribbon. I was ready to hear every word. I was ready to notice what others ignored. And when the time came to stand in the open instead of the hallway, I knew exactly where I'd be. The first whispers began 2 days later. At the grocery store, in the soft hum of checkout lines, 2 women stood by the apples and spoke in lowered voices. They didn't see me at first. $4 billion one said, the disbelief sharp in her tone, and he banned his own father. "Some people have more money than sense." The other woman shook her head. "Not his money, from what I hear. The old man's." Their laughter faded as they walked away, leaving the sound of rustling paper bags and the sting of words that echoed too close to home. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were trembling. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, watching the rain bead against the windshield. The story had already escaped our house and was making its rounds like gossip always does, quiet at first, then everywhere. My father's perfect image was starting to crack. That evening, Jason showed up at my door. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. "Stella," he said, voice low, "you have to help me." I stepped aside and he walked in, pacing the length of my small living room. "The vendors are calling nonstop," he said. "They're threatening to cancel everything. Victoria's family is furious. Dad keeps saying Grandpa will come through, but what if he doesn't?" I folded my arms, leaning against the counter. "You really think Grandpa will pay after being treated like that?" Jason ran a hand through his hair. "He always has. He's stubborn, but he loves us. He'll come around. He has to." "No," I said quietly. "He doesn't, and he won't. You think this is about money, but it's not. It's about respect, Jason. About how you all erased him to impress people who don't care about you." His shoulders slumped. "I didn't want to ban him," he said, his voice breaking. "That was Dad and Victoria. I just went along. I studied his face, looking for the brother I used to know." "You went along," I repeated. "That's what you always do. You go along until there's nothing left of you but whatever makes everyone else comfortable." He looked down at the floor. "If Grandpa doesn't pay, the wedding falls apart. It's too late to cancel." "Then maybe it should fall apart," I said. "Maybe that's the only way any of you will see what this really is." He opened his mouth, then shut it again. For a moment, the room filled with the sound of rain tapping against the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "I can't fix this." "No," I said softly, "but you can stop making it worse." He didn't answer. He just nodded, defeated, and left without another word. I watched him walk down the steps, his shoulders hunched against the rain. Later that night, I found Grandpa sitting in his study, polishing the silver handle of his cane. He didn't look surprised when I told him about Jason's visit. He only said, "Good." The truth always arrives when the noise gets loud enough. I sat down across from him. "They're desperate, Grandpa. The vendors, Victoria's family, everyone's losing patience. Dad's pretending he's in control, but it's unraveling fast." Grandpa smiled faintly, not out of joy, but understanding. "Arrogance builds quickly," he said, "but it collapses faster." In the days that followed, the house grew tense. My father barked orders over the phone from dawn until midnight. I could hear his voice from the hallway growing sharper with each call. "You'll get your payment," he snapped at one point. "Don't threaten me with cancellations. Do you know who I am?" The silence afterward was heavier than the shouting. When I stepped into the doorway, he was standing by his desk, red-faced and shaking. His eyes found mine, cold and furious. "This is none of your concern," he said. "Go back to whatever it is you do." I crossed my arms. "You mean living honestly?" His jaw tightened. "Don't test me, or what I asked. You'll ban me too, like you did. Grandpa?" Jason was sitting nearby, pale and silent. He looked up, then back down like he wanted to disappear. "Maybe we should just scale back," he said quietly. "Victoria and I can—" "Scale back?" my father barked. "You want to humiliate yourself in front of her family. You want them to think we can't afford it." Victoria appeared in the doorway holding her phone. "We can't cut corners," she said. "My parents are expecting perfection. I couldn't hold it in anymore." "Perfection? You're marrying into a mess built on lies, and you're worried about floral arrangements. You've already sold your dignity, all of you." My father turned on me, his voice shaking. "You sound just like him. Always moralizing, always judging. Henry thinks money buys respect, but it doesn't, power does. And I'll prove it." He stormed out, leaving the room filled with a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Jason stood there looking lost while Victoria scrolled through her phone as if none of it mattered. That night, I went upstairs to Grandpa's study. He was by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. "It's starting," I said. He nodded. "The higher a man builds his tower of pride, the harder it falls." "Dad's unraveling," I said. "He's furious, desperate. Jason's caught in the middle." "Then let him stay there," Grandpa replied gently. He needs to understand what loyalty costs when it's given to the wrong person. The next morning, the phones rang nonstop again. Caterers demanded final payments. Florists threatened to cancel. Even the estate manager left messages, each more urgent than the last. From my father's office came the sound of something breaking, maybe a pen holder, maybe his patience. I stood in the kitchen doorway, coffee cup in hand, as he yelled into the phone, "Don't you dare talk to me about refunds! The wedding goes on. Do you hear me? It goes on." His face was red, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. "My father will cover everything," he said, then paused. The silence that followed made him look smaller somehow. "He will," he repeated, but this time it didn't sound like certainty. He slammed the phone down, then turned and saw me. "What are you looking at?" he barked. "Someone losing control," I said quietly. His glare could have cut glass. "You think you're better than me?" "No," I said, "just not as blind." For a long moment neither of us moved. Then he walked past me, muttering under his breath, the echo of his anger following him down the hall. That evening I heard Grandpa's cane tap against the floor upstairs. I met him halfway down the hallway. "It's all coming apart," I said. "They're drowning." He rested a hand on his cane and looked at me with calm, steady eyes. "Let them," he said. "A lesson learned in comfort is a lesson forgotten. But pain carves truth deep enough to remember." The wind outside picked up, whistling through the gaps in the old window frames. It carried the scent of rain again, heavy and cold. Grandpa turned toward the sound and added softly, "Let Richard feel the storm he invited." I nodded. There wasn't much else to say. The walls of our home had grown thin, every word and secret leaking through. By the next day, the story would spread further, and the pressure would reach its breaking point. I could feel it in the air the moment before thunder, when the world holds its breath. Something was coming, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to face it. The following morning, the house felt quieter than usual, as if the air itself had grown heavy from all the shouting. My father stayed in his office making phone calls that never seemed to end. Every so often, I'd hear his voice rise, followed by the sharp click of the receiver slamming down. It was a rhythm now, his anger filling the house, then silence rushing in to take its place. Grandpa spent most of his time in his study, the door slightly ajar. He didn't need to say much. His calm had weight. It didn't feel passive or detached. It felt measured, like someone watching a chessboard instead of a battlefield. When I brought him tea, he looked up and said, "Only patience, Stella. Don't confuse noise for progress." I knew what he meant. Dad was loud because he was losing control. The louder he became, the more desperate he sounded. The phone calls, the long hours, pacing the orders, barked at no one. It was all part of the same unraveling. That afternoon, I stopped by the Ashford estate with an excuse about the seating chart. Mark Brennan, the planner, greeted me in his usual polished tone, though the circles under his eyes told another story. His office was covered in fabric samples, wine lists, and vendor contracts, all scattered in a kind of organized panic. "Miss Carter," he said, forcing a smile, "we're just about there. Just a few final payments pending, but everything's coming together beautifully." "Is it?" I asked, setting my bag on the edge of his desk. "Because, from what I've heard, your vendors are getting restless." He hesitated, then folded his hands. "I'm doing my best to keep them calm. But yes, without the final transfer, we're running out of time." I pulled the cream-colored envelope from my bag and slid it toward him. "You've seen this?" He nodded. "Your father assured me Mr. Henry Carter would handle all expenses. He also banned Mr. Henry Carter from attending," I said evenly. "So I think you might want to prepare for a change of plans." Mark blinked. "Banned." His voice cracked slightly. "That's news to me." I leaned forward. "Grandpa isn't paying a cent. Not for a wedding he's not even allowed to attend." The color drained from his face. He tugged at his cufflinks before answering. "If that's true, we have a serious problem. The entire event depends on his contribution." "Then maybe you should prepare for a storm," I said quietly. Mark's composure cracked for the first time. He scribbled something on his notepad and nodded stiffly. "Understood." When I left the office, the air outside felt lighter, as if something had shifted. I didn't feel triumphant, just certain. The cracks in my father's perfect facade were spreading faster than he realized, and now they had names, contracts, and numbers attached. That evening, I returned home and found Grandpa waiting in his study. The lamp beside him cast a soft golden light over the bookshelves, catching on the edge of his silver cane. Well, he asked without looking up. "The planner knows the truth now," I said. "He admitted everything depends on you." Grandpa gave a small nod, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Then we don't have to do anything else," he murmured. "Let time do the work." I sank into the chair across from him. "You really think this will be enough arrogance," he said, "is its own undoing? Your father built this day on borrowed respect. It was never meant to stand." He looked calm, but there was a quiet resolve behind his words. I realized then that Grandpa wasn't just waiting for the fall, he was teaching me how to stand still while it happened. 2 days later, the gossip grew louder. The story about my father's demands had made its way through the Lexington Society. At the cafe near the square, I overheard 2 men discussing it over their newspapers. "Can you believe it?" one said. "Bans his father and then sends him a bill." The other chuckled. "Old Henry's no fool. He'll let them hang themselves with their own rope." I stirred my coffee and stared out the window, pretending not to hear. It wasn't pride I felt, it was confirmation. My father had built his reputation on charm and borrowed confidence, but now his name was being whispered for all the wrong reasons. That evening, Grandpa called me into his study again. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Tell me what you've seen." "The vendors are nervous," I said. "The rumors are spreading. Even Victoria's family is starting to ask questions." "Good," he said softly. "Appearances have weight, Stella. Your father worships them. But when the mirror cracks, what's reflected can destroy him faster than any argument." He tapped his cane against the floor once sharply. "He believes power is about control. Let him learn it's about integrity." Outside, the wind began to rise, sweeping against the windows. It carried the smell of rain, faint but unmistakable. Grandpa looked toward the sound. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "The wind," he nodded. "That's what pride sounds like before it breaks." The next morning brought more calls, more shouting, and more excuses. I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee as my father's voice echoed through the walls. "You can't cancel on me. The funds are coming, yes. My father will transfer them." There was a long pause, then a quieter tone, almost pleading. "Just hold a little longer." When he slammed the phone down, I stepped into the doorway. "Still waiting for Grandpa to save you?" He spun around, eyes blazing. "You think this is funny? You think I built all this for nothing? You built it on lies," I said. "You banned the one person who could have made it work." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what it means to have power, Stella." "Then maybe you don't understand what it means to have family." Jason appeared behind him, pale and silent. "Dad, maybe we should scale back," he said quietly. "Victoria and I—" "Scale back," my father snapped. "You sound weak. Do you want to look poor in front of her family?" Victoria entered the room, then, still in her silk robe, scrolling through her phone. "We can't scale back," she said without looking up. "My parents are already flying guests in. Everything has to be perfect." I shook my head. "Perfect? The only thing perfect here is your arrogance." My father's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "You sound just like him, always preaching, always judging." His hand trembled slightly as he pointed toward the door. "Get out, Stella. You're not part of this family anymore." I didn't move. "You already made that clear when you banned Grandpa." The silence that followed felt endless. Then Jason whispered, "Maybe Stella's right." My father turned on him so fast I thought he might strike him. "Don't you start," he hissed. "You're about to marry into money. Don't throw that away because your sister wants to play moral guardian." Jason looked down, defeated. Victoria crossed her arms and turned toward the staircase. "I'll be in touch with the planner," she said coldly. When they were gone, I exhaled and turned back to Grandpa's study upstairs. He was waiting calm as ever. "It's getting worse," I said. He nodded. "It has to. Dad's desperate. Jason's drowning." "Then let them feel the weight," he said. "No one learns the cost of pride without paying it." I sat in the chair beside him, the lamplight flickering between us. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, slow and deep. "Grandpa?" I said quietly. "You're not angry anymore, are you?" He smiled faintly. "Anger burns out too quickly. Patience leaves ashes they can see." The storm outside rattled the windows, wind pressing against the glass. I looked at him, then steady, unflinching, and realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just his lesson for my father. It was one for me, too. Because sometimes strength doesn't roar. Sometimes it waits. And as the rain began to fall, tapping against the house like the ticking of a clock, I knew the waiting was almost over. The storm had gathered its force. Soon it would break. The rain hadn't stopped since dawn, thin streaks sliding down the window panes and turning the garden into a blur of gray and green. The house felt still, but it wasn't a peaceful stillness. It was the kind that comes before something breaks. My father had been on the phone all morning, his voice low, then raised, then low again. Each call ended the same way, with a slammed receiver and silence so sharp it made the air hum. By mid-afternoon, I decided to go see Mark Brennan again. The planner's office sat high above the city, all glass and chrome, a world away from the tension of our home. When I stepped inside, the receptionist hesitated clearly, remembering the last time I'd come by. She started to speak, but Mark's voice called out from behind his door, "Send her in." He stood by the window jacket, off sleeves rolled, staring out at the skyline. His desk looked worse than before, littered with invoices, emails, and sticky notes. He turned as I entered. "Miss Carter," he said, tired but polite. "I assume this isn't a social visit. It's about the wedding," I said, taking a seat. "You should know my grandfather still has no intention of paying for it." He rubbed his forehead. "Your father told me otherwise this morning. He said the transfer was being processed." "That's not happening," I said. "He's bluffing. And you deserve to know before this gets worse." Mark exhaled slowly, the sound almost a sigh. "If that's true, I'm not sure we can continue. We've already extended deadlines. The estate manager called again today. Without final payment, the venue will be released by tomorrow night." "Then release it," I said quietly. "Don't let him drag you down with him." He looked at me, unsure whether to be angry or relieved. "You're asking me to walk away from a multi-million-dollar contract. I'm asking you to protect yourself," I said. "Because when it collapses, my father will blame everyone but himself." Mark nodded slowly, like he'd already known that truth, but needed someone to say it out loud. "I'll notify the estate," he said. "And the vendors. They deserve to know." When I stood to leave, he called after me. "Miss Carter?" I paused in the doorway. "This whole thing, it's going to make headlines." I met his eyes. "Then maybe it should." By the time I reached home, the phone in my father's office was ringing nonstop. Through the closed door, I could hear his voice, angry, frantic, losing the edge that used to make people listen. "You can't cancel now," he snapped. "We have a contract." A pause, then louder. "Don't threaten me with refunds. You'll get your payment." He slammed the phone down so hard I heard the crack of plastic. When I stepped into the doorway, he spun around. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," I said. "This is none of your business." "It became my business the moment you dragged Grandpa into this," I replied. "You banned him, humiliated him, and then tried to take his money. You've made a fool of yourself, and now everyone knows it." His face flushed, a deep red climbing up his neck. "You think you understand how the world works. You don't. Appearances matter. Reputation matters. That's what builds a future." "Reputation," I said quietly. "You mean fear. You've been living off Grandpa's name for years, pretending it's your own." Jason was standing by the window again, pale and silent. "Dad," he said softly, "maybe we should scale things back." "Victoria and I can—" "Enough!" my father roared. "You sound like a coward. You want to embarrass yourself in front of her family." Victoria's heels clicked across the tile as she entered the room. She was still in her robe hair, perfectly styled phone in hand. "We can't scale back," she said without looking up. "My parents are already on their way. Everything has to stay exactly as planned." I couldn't help it. I laughed bitter and low. "Exactly as planned? You mean unpaid vendors, canceled orders, and guests whispering about your family in the papers?" Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "No," I said, "but the people you hired do." My father pointed toward the door, trembling with fury. "Get out, Stella. You've done enough damage." I stood my ground. "The only damage done here is by you. Grandpa tried to teach you dignity, but you turned it into debt." The room went still. Jason looked between us, lips parted, searching for something to say, but finding nothing. Victoria crossed her arms and turned away. My father's eyes hardened, but behind the anger I saw something new: fear. That night the storm outside grew stronger. Rain hammered the roof, thunder rolling in the distance. The house creaked like it was listening to us. Downstairs my father's voice kept echoing lower, now less sure. "I'll fix it," I heard him mutter. "I always fix it." When I finally went upstairs, Grandpa was in his study, the light low, his cane resting against the desk. He looked up as I entered. "You've done well," he said. "You didn't shout. You didn't fight. You simply told the truth." "They're not listening," I said. "They don't need to." "Not yet." I sat across from him, the storm wind rattling the window panes. "What happens now?" He smiled faintly. "Now we wait. You've given the first push. Pride does the rest." The calm in his voice unsettled me at first, but then I understood. This wasn't revenge. It was justice unfolding quiet and sure. The house we grew up in was built on pride, but it was cracking under the weight of its own pretense. The next day the phone stopped ringing. Maybe people had stopped expecting answers. Maybe they already knew the truth. Jason avoided everyone pacing the backyard in the rain until his shoes sank into the mud. Victoria stayed upstairs making calls that always ended with the same frustrated tone. When I brought tea to Grandpa's study that evening, he took the cup, his expression thoughtful. "Do you remember what I told you?" he asked. "About storms?" He nodded. "A storm doesn't rage when it begins. It builds quietly. But once it moves, there's no stopping it." I looked toward the window. The rain had eased to a mist, but the clouds hadn't lifted. "It's close, isn't it?" He tapped his cane lightly against the floor. "Very close." That night I dreamed of the estate, the grand hall empty, the flowers wilting, the music gone silent. And in the center stood my father, still wearing his suit, staring at the empty seats as if he could will them full again. When I woke the next morning, the air felt different, heavy, charged, the kind of air that holds its breath right before lightning strikes. Grandpa was already dressed, his tie neat, his shoes polished. He met my eyes and gave a small nod. Today he said simply, "I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew." Downstairs, my father was shouting into the phone again, but his voice sounded thinner now, desperate instead of commanding. Jason stood nearby trying to reason with him, but every word bounced off the wall of pride between them. I waited until they paused, then spoke. "You can't stop what's coming, Dad." He turned his face pale. "And what exactly is coming?" "Stella." "The truth," I said. Outside, thunder rolled once more, deep and slow. Grandpa's cane tapped against the tile as he stepped into the hallway. The sound silenced everyone. He looked calm, too. Calm. And that's when I realized the storm wasn't outside anymore. It was already here, waiting to break. And tomorrow, it would. The morning of Jason's wedding arrived beneath a gray, unbroken sky. The rain had started before dawn, thin at first, then steady, soaking through the trees and turning the gravel drive into slick patches of mud. I stood by my window watching it fall, the sound dull and rhythmic, like the house itself was holding its breath. By the time I reached the Ashford estate, the grand white columns glistened with water, and the driveway was littered with umbrellas left open in a hurry. Inside, the chaos was immediate. Florists were packing up half-finished arrangements, their voices sharp over the echo of thunder. A few men in soaked suits carried boxes of decorations back toward waiting vans. One woman muttered to another, "No payment, no flowers," before the doors slammed behind her. I moved through the hall quietly past clusters of guests, whispering under their breath. The grand staircase was draped in ribbons that had started to sag in the humidity. Beyond it, in the ballroom, a string quartet was closing their cases. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, gave me a small nod before walking out, violin tucked under his arm. Victoria stood near the center of the room, her white gown clinging to her shoulders where the rain had touched it. Her makeup artist was packing up her brushes. "You can't leave, Victoria," said her voice cracking. "Do you know who I am?" The woman paused at the door, weary and drenched. "Yes," she said, "and I also know what a contract means." Then she was gone. Jason was near the front, staring at the empty chairs set up for guests who hadn't arrived. His hands were trembling. I could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the chill in the room. When he looked at me, his eyes were hollow. "It's falling apart," he whispered. Before I could answer, the heavy doors swung open behind us. My father stepped in his tie, crooked his hair damp from the rain. His voice boomed through the hall. "Where is Brennan?" he shouted. "Get the planner in here! We have a wedding to run." Mark Brennan appeared a few seconds later, clutching a clipboard. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice barely steady. "I've done everything I can, but without payment, no one will stay. The vendors have already left." "Then bring them back." My father barked. "This wedding will happen." "My father." He caught himself. Mid-sentence, eyes darting toward me. "I mean, the money will come. Just hold them a little longer." Mark lowered his clipboard. "I'm sorry, sir. It's out of my hands now." My father's face twisted in fury. He took a step toward him, but before he could speak again, I found my own voice. "He's right, Dad." I said the words steady, even as my heart pounded. "You can't force this to happen. Grandpa won't pay, not after what you did." The crowd went still. Even the whispering stopped. Jason turned to look at me, his expression torn between shock and relief. Victoria hissed under her breath. "Someone shut her up." But I didn't stop. "You banned him from the wedding, you humiliated him, and then you sent him a bill for $4 billion. You thought money could buy respect, but all it bought you is this." A sharp crack of thunder shook the windows, and then, like something out of a story, the double doors at the far end of the hall opened again. Standing there, framed by the storm, was Grandpa. He wore a dark suit, pressed and perfect, despite the rain. His silver cane glinted with each step as he entered. The guests parted, murmuring their voices low and uncertain. His presence filled the room, not loud or angry, but commanding, like gravity itself had shifted toward him. "Grandpa," Jason whispered. My father's face went pale. "You," he said, his voice breaking. "You weren't invited." Grandpa stopped at the center of the hall and smiled faintly. "Yes, Richard," he said calmly. "I noticed." The room was silent except for the rain against the windows. My father took a step forward, shaking. "Why are you here to watch?" Grandpa said. "To see what you've built without me." His gaze swept across the room, the half-decorated tables, the empty chairs, the guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. His eyes returned to my father. "It seems the foundation wasn't very strong." Victoria rushed forward, clutching at her gown. "Mr. Carter, please, you have to help us. My parents are watching. Everyone is watching. If you don't step in, we'll be ruined." Grandpa's expression didn't change. "My dear, reputations are not purchased. They are earned. And at this moment, yours appears to be in debt." Jason stepped toward him, voice trembling. "Grandpa, I never wanted this. I didn't want to ban you. It was Dad, it was Victoria. I just went along." Grandpa raised a hand. "You're a grown man, Jason. You make your own choices. And when you choose silence in the face of wrong, you choose cowardice." The words hit like a stone. Jason's head dropped. My father exploded. "Enough!" he shouted. "You think you're better than me? You've spent your life hiding behind money behind that company. I don't need you, Henry. I never did." Grandpa didn't flinch. "And yet you built this day on the assumption that I would pay for it," he said quietly. "Tell me, Richard, what does that make you?" No one spoke. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Even Victoria stepped back, her cheeks flushing with anger and shame. Finally, Grandpa's voice rose calm but strong enough to fill the room. "Let this be your lesson, Richard. Pride without respect is nothing. Wealth without gratitude is ash. You wanted to erase me from this family, and now your arrogance has erased your wedding." As if on cue, the last of the staff began rolling their carts toward the exit. The half-decorated tables stood bare. The smell of damp flowers lingered in the air. One of the guests whispered just loud enough for all to hear, "$4 billion for this." My father's knees buckled. He dropped into a chair, his hands gripping his head. Jason stood beside him, silent, lost. Victoria turned and fled through the side door, her gown dragging through a puddle of rainwater that had pooled on the marble floor. Grandpa turned to me, his voice softer now. "Stella," he said, "remember this moment. This is what happens when arrogance tries to disguise itself as power. I nodded, unable to speak. The thunder outside rolled again, deep and distant. The guests began to leave their footsteps echoing down the hall. When the last of them were gone, the estate was quiet, except for the rain tapping against the windows. The wedding was over before it began. The empire my father had tried to build on pride, on image, on borrowed respect, had fallen in a single afternoon. Grandpa looked around once more, then turned to go. As he passed my father, he paused, resting one hand on his cane. "I hope you find peace, Richard," he said, "but first I hope you find humility." He walked out into the rain, steady and unhurried. I followed him to the door, watching as his figure disappeared down the path toward his car. For a moment I stood there listening to the storm fade into a gentle drizzle. Behind me, the hall was silent. Jason sat beside our father, head bowed. The chandeliers above them flickered once, then dimmed. The storm had passed, but nothing would ever be the same again. The rain didn't stop that night. It came down in sheets, drumming against the windows of the Ashford estate long after the guests had gone. The grand hall stood empty now, chairs overturned, flower petals scattered like confetti from a storm. The air still carried the faint scent of champagne and wet silk. I walked through the echoing room slowly, my shoes brushing against the damp floor, each step sounding louder than it should. When I reached the back doors, I saw the gardens outside, submerged in shallow pools of rainwater. The once pristine lawns were streaked with mud and trampled blossoms. For a moment it was hard to believe that only hours earlier this place had been meant for celebration. Now it looked like the aftermath of a battle. By the time I returned home, the house was silent. The lights in my father's study were still on, casting a dull glow across the hallway. I hesitated at the door before pushing it open. Richard sat behind his desk, his shoulders hunched, a half-empty glass of whiskey near his elbow. The papers on his desk were soaked from where his hand had rested, either from sweat or spilled liquor, I couldn't tell. He didn't look up right away. "You think you've won, don't you?" he muttered finally. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual authority. I stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind me. "There was never anything to win, Dad," I said. "This wasn't a game." He turned toward me, and for the first time I saw how old he looked. The anger had drained out of him, leaving something smaller defeat, maybe. "I just wanted to prove myself," he said quietly, "to show the world I wasn't living in his shadow." I stood there for a moment, trying to find the right words. "You didn't need to prove anything," I said, "but you tried to build a legacy out of pride, and pride doesn't hold." He looked down at the papers again, his hands trembling slightly. "Without him," he whispered, "everything crumbles." "That's not true," I said softly. "Without gratitude, everything crumbles. There's a difference." He didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, heavy but honest. It wasn't the kind that asked for forgiveness. It was the kind that finally admitted the truth. When I left his study, I found Jason sitting on the front steps. His tuxedo jacket was gone, his shirt collar undone, his hair damp from the rain. He looked up when he heard me. "It's over," he said. I sat beside him. The air smelled of wet earth and cold stone. "It is," I said. He ran a hand over his face. "I ruined everything." "No," I said quietly. "You let them make choices for you. That's not the same." He shook his head. "Grandpa will never forgive me. He doesn't need to." I told him. "He just needs to see you learn from it." Jason stared out at the street for a long moment. "I wanted to make everyone happy," he said finally. "Dad, Victoria, her family. I thought if I stayed quiet it would all work out." "Silence isn't peace," I said. "It's just surrender." He nodded, his jaw, tight eyes glistening. Then he whispered, "I don't even know where she went. Victoria." He nodded again. "She left right after the guests. Didn't say a word." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Some lessons had to come the hard way. The next morning, the storm had finally passed. The air felt new, washed clean, but the house was still thick with what had happened. My father stayed in his study with the blinds drawn. Jason barely touched his breakfast. And yet there was a strange calm to it all, like the first breath after a long cry. Later that afternoon, I drove out to Grandpa's estate. The rain had left his garden glistening, every leaf shining with drops of water. He was outside, kneeling by the rose bushes, pruning the stems with slow, practiced care. When he looked up and saw me, his expression softened. "It's over," I said, stepping closer. He smiled faintly. "No, Stella," he said. "It's only beginning." I frowned. "How do you mean?" He wiped his hands on a towel and stood leaning on his cane. "The truth is out now," he said. "Your father can't hide behind appearances anymore. And Jason, he'll have to decide who he wants to become." I followed him toward the porch. The air smelled of damp wood and rain-soaked roses. "And you?" I asked. He glanced at me, his eyes clear and steady. "Me," he said. "I've seen enough storms to know they don't destroy everything. Sometimes they clear the air." We sat together on the porch, the boards creaking beneath our chairs. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sunlight filtered through the clouds, warm and gold, catching on the dew. Finally, he looked at me again. "You did well," he said. "You stood up when no one else would." "I just told the truth," I said. "That's more courage than most people ever find," he replied. "You reminded this family what matters and what doesn't." I swallowed hard emotion pressing at the back of my throat. "I didn't do much," I said. "You were the one who—" He raised a hand gently. "No, Stella. You spoke when others stayed silent. You carried what dignity looks like when everything around you falls apart." The words lingered between us, carried softly by the breeze. I looked out over the garden, the roses swaying gently, the path winding through the green. The world felt fragile, but somehow lighter too. By evening, the house had grown quiet again. My father stayed behind his closed door. Jason packed up the last of his things from the room he'd shared with Victoria and left without a word. I watched him from the window, his car rolling slowly down the drive, the taillights fading into the distance. In the garden, Grandpa's silhouette stood among the roses, his cane glinting in the last of the sunlight. I joined him, and we stood side by side for a long time without speaking. The air was cool, the horizon glowing faintly pink. I could hear the faint chirp of crickets beginning their evening song. Grandpa turned toward me, his expression gentle but firm. "Pride brought this family to its knees," he said. "Now it's time to rebuild on something stronger." I nodded. "Respect," I said. He smiled. "And love," he added. We stayed there until the light faded completely. The world around us was still the chaos behind us at last. Yet even in the quiet, I knew this story wasn't finished. The storm had passed, but now came the part that mattered most, what we would build from what remained. The next few weeks passed quietly, like the world had taken a deep breath and decided to rest. The storm was gone, but its mark lingered. The house felt different, lighter in some corners, emptier in others. My father stayed mostly in his study blinds, half drawn, moving like a man who wasn't sure what to do with the silence he'd created. The phone stopped ringing. The constant tension in his voice disappeared, replaced by something closer to weariness. Jason came by often after that. He didn't talk much at first, but his visits became steadier, more deliberate. One afternoon he stood by the kitchen counter with a small folder in his hands. "I'm selling the honeymoon tickets," he said, sliding them across the marble. "It's time to make things right. Grandpa doesn't owe me a thing." I nodded, proud but quiet. "He'll see that I said. Just keep showing him who you are." Later that day I drove out to Grandpa's estate again. The late autumn air had turned crisp, carrying the faint scent of burning leaves from a neighbor's yard. Grandpa was on the porch, reading by the fading light, his cane resting beside him. When he saw me, he smiled, the kind that softened his whole face. "Jason stopped by earlier," he said, setting the book aside. "He's trying to mend what's been broken." I sat down beside him. "He's learning," I said. Grandpa nodded slowly. "Good. It's never too late to start choosing better." We sat in silence for a while, watching the light drift across the yard. The roses were starting to fade, their petals curled at the edges, but even in their decay, they were beautiful. Grandpa leaned back and said, "Do you know what I thought about during that storm, what I asked? That sometimes losing everything you've built is the only way to remember what matters. Your father forgot that, and for a while I think we all did." I looked at him, then really looked at him. the man who'd held our family together more times than any of us deserved. "He's trying, Grandpa," I said softly. "Maybe not perfectly, but he's trying." He smiled again, smaller this time. "That's all a man can do. Pride can be stubborn, but humility, it has its own quiet strength." As the sun dipped below the trees, we went inside. He poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to me, steam curling into the air between us. "You've done well, Stella," he said. "You didn't let bitterness guide you. You let truth do the work." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You were the one who taught me that." He gave a soft laugh. "I might have taught it, but you lived it." That night after I left his house, I drove by the estate where the wedding had fallen apart. The lights were off now, the grand entryway dark. I parked for a moment by the gate, remembering the thunder, the laughter that had turned to whispers, and the look on my father's face when everything crumbled. It was strange how ruin could become the first step toward rebuilding. When I got home, I found a note waiting on the kitchen table in my father's handwriting. It was brief. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I'll make amends if it's not too late." It wasn't an apology wrapped in excuses. It was just human. And for the first time in years, I believed him. The next morning, Jason called to say he'd met with Grandpa again. They'd walked the garden together, talked for hours. No money exchanged hands, no promises made. Just a start. And that was enough. Weeks later, when winter began to settle, Grandpa invited us all for dinner. It was simple roast chicken, a bottle of wine, a fire crackling in the hearth. My father arrived last, wearing the same dark suit he'd once used to impress people who didn't matter. But this time, he looked different. Smaller, quieter. He didn't speak much during the meal, but when Grandpa lifted his glass and said, "To dignity reclaimed," my father met his eyes and whispered, "To family restored." No one said another word. We didn't need to. When the night ended, I walked Grandpa out to the porch. The stars were bright, the air clear. He leaned on his cane and looked up. "Storms don't always destroy, Stella," he said. "Sometimes they clear the air for something new to grow." I smiled, remembering the day of the wedding, the chaos, the rain, the silence that followed. "You were right," I said, "about everything." He chuckled softly. "No, not everything, but enough." He reached out and squeezed my hand, his grip warm and steady. "You're the reason this family found its footing again. Don't ever doubt that." When I drove home later, the road shimmered under the moonlight. The world felt calm, and for the first time in a long while, so did I. We had been broken by pride, tested by greed, and reshaped by truth. But what remained was something stronger, a quiet kind of love born out of loss and courage. And that's what I hold on to now, the lesson that storms come for a reason. They strip away what's false, leaving only what's real, the kind of love and dignity that no wealth can buy. If you've ever weathered a storm of your own, I hope you found that too. Because sometimes the calm that follows isn't just peace, it's renewal. Thank you for listening. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need it, and take a moment to breathe in the quiet after your own storm.